I never imagined that turning 73 would feel like this. Quiet, peaceful, and strangely victorious. This morning, I woke up without an alarm, without a voice calling my name, without the weight of anyone else's needs pressing against my chest. Just me, my breath, my thoughts, and the soft morning light slipping through the curtains Marcus installed decades ago. I brewed myself a cup of fresh coffee, the kind I used to save for guests, never for myself, and placed a small slice of birthday cake on a plate. No party, no forced smiles, no pretending, just a quiet celebration of the woman I fought so hard to become. As I sat at the table, the steam rising from my cup, I realized something almost unbelievable. For the first time in decades, every moment of this day belonged entirely to me. And that feeling, that freedom, it wrapped around me like warm sunlight after a long winter. Ezra, my grandson, was born 4 months after the eviction. A storm that nearly destroyed me but ultimately rebuilt me. When I held him for the first time, so tiny, so innocent, with those curious eyes that reminded me of Marcus, I made a promise to myself. I would love him, cherish him, and be present for him, but never again at the cost of my own life. So I set boundaries. Simple, clear, non-negotiable. Sunday visits only. 2 hours. To my home. No last-minute babysitting. No emotional manipulation disguised as, "Help us, Mom." I had given too much for too long, and I refused to lose myself again. Terrence and Tiffany tested those boundaries more times than I can count. They tried to slide back into their old habits, calling me at dawn, expecting me to drop everything, insisting that family helps family. But I had finally learned the truth. Help without respect becomes servitude. And I was done being anyone's unpaid servant. They offered me $150 a week to watch Ezra for 40 hours, less than $4 an hour. They said it like they were doing me a favor. I stayed firm. My voice didn't shake. My heart didn't crumble. I simply said, "No, that doesn't work for me," and let the silence do the rest. Their first year on their own was brutal. The kind of year that makes or breaks a family. Terrence lost his job at the insurance company because he was always late, juggling sleepless nights and overdue bills. Tiffany went back to work barely 2 months after giving birth, making almost nothing at a cheap salon. Their combined income could barely keep them afloat. Rent, utilities, food, baby expenses. Everything stacked against them like an avalanche waiting to fall. And each time they came to me, voices trembling, asking for money, I didn't cave. Not this time. I gave them advice, not cash. I told them to move to a cheaper place, sell the sports car, cut unnecessary expenses. They didn't like hearing it. People rarely do when the truth requires sacrifice. But I stayed strong. Because deep down I knew something they didn't. Struggle is a teacher that comfort can never replace. The second year brought a kind of change I never expected. The kind that sneaks in quietly, like dawn after a long night. Terrence finally found steady work with a construction company, earning enough to keep the lights on without begging anyone for help. Not because he suddenly became responsible on his own, but because the bank threatened to repossess that ridiculous sports car he clung to like a badge of pride. Pressure has a way of forcing people to grow up. And Terrence, he finally did. Tiffany found a better salon and increased her income too. And little by little, they started living within their means for the first time in their entire adult lives. No more frantic calls at midnight. No more guilt tripping. No more assuming I existed to rescue them. But the real transformation wasn't in their bank account. It was in Terrence's eyes when he came for Sunday visits. He arrived on time. He thanked me sincerely for spending time with Ezra. He even asked about my life, my hobbies, my days, something he hadn't done in years. He still never apologized outright, but sometimes behavior speaks louder than words. Tiffany remained cool, polite in that stiff way that lets you know someone isn't ready to let go of their resentment. But that was fine. Boundaries don't require approval, only consistency. And with each passing week, I could feel something shifting inside me too. The heavy weight I'd carried for years lifting, the exhaustion fading. For the first time in forever, I could breathe without feeling like someone else depended on that breath to survive. The first year after reclaiming my home was a mixture of quiet triumph and subtle adjustments. Each morning, I awoke without the burden of serving someone else's needs before my own. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the aroma and warmth, feeling the deep satisfaction of a life no longer dictated by the demands of Terrence and Tiffany. I found myself reflecting on the immense relief of having control over my own space, realizing that it had been stolen from me for far too long. The silence of my house was no longer empty. It was filled with my own presence, my own choices, and the slow rhythmic heartbeat of my reclaimed freedom. Ezra, my grandson, became a light in my life that glowed differently because it was shared on my terms. Sunday afternoons were sacred, reserved for playful moments, story time, and laughter that echoed through the living room. I watched him grow, learning new words and developing his personality, and I felt pride without being used. I realized that true love did not require servitude or endless sacrifice. It could flourish within boundaries, mutual respect, and structured affection. Terrence and Tiffany began to adapt to these boundaries, albeit slowly. Their initial resistance melted into cautious cooperation. Terrence, though not yet remorseful, showed glimpses of responsibility in his punctuality and attentiveness. Tiffany's expressions softened, even if she occasionally carried the weight of blame for their prior hardships. Financially, the difference was monumental. My $1,000 monthly pension, once stretched thin to cover the needs of others, now supported my personal pursuits, small luxuries, and investments in my hobbies. I joined a local gym, rediscovering the strength in my body and the joy of movement. Sewing, a passion I had neglected for decades, returned to my life, allowing me to create garments for myself and neighbors, cultivating both independence and creativity. My garden, a sanctuary once overshadowed by constant demands, bloomed with life and color, reflecting the new vibrancy of my existence. Each day, as I watered my plants and listened to the songbirds, I felt a quiet pride in the life I had fought to reclaim, a satisfaction that no one could take from me. Even as I embraced my solitude, I discovered the richness of selective companionship. Brenda became a trusted friend, offering empathy without expectation. We shared stories, laughter, and advice, forming a bond that reinforced my sense of self. Relatives like Rhonda re-entered my life, enriching it with shared interests, museum visits, and intellectual conversations that reminded me of my capacity for connection outside of manipulation or exploitation. Slowly, I understood that chosen solitude, coupled with meaningful relationships, was infinitely more rewarding than being surrounded by those who drained me emotionally, regardless of familial ties. This first year was a revelation. I learned that freedom was not just a legal matter but an emotional one. It was waking up to choose how to spend my day. It was enjoying coffee at my own pace, reading books without interruption, and savoring the quiet of my home. It was rediscovering my own identity, independent of anyone else's needs or expectations. And within this newfound freedom, I could witness Ezra grow, interact with him fully, and delight in his presence without sacrificing my own peace. The lessons were slowly embedding themselves in Terrence and Tiffany, though their understanding of boundaries would take time to cement. I had set the tone. Respect my home, respect my space, and respect me. And in doing so, I had found a peace I had not known I could achieve. The second year brought subtle but profound changes in both my life and the lives of Terrence and Tiffany. Terrence finally secured steady employment at a construction company, earning $1,000 a week, a responsibility that forced him to confront the realities of adulthood. Tiffany, too, increased her income, moving to a more established salon where she earned $300 weekly. For the first time, they lived within their actual means, managing rent, utilities, and the costs of raising Ezra without relying on me to bail them out. Observing their struggle from a distance, I felt neither guilt nor superiority, only the calm satisfaction of knowing that my earlier decision had been necessary. They were learning lessons they would have ignored had I continued enabling them. Our Sunday visits with Ezra became richer, deeper, and more joyful. I began creating small rituals, story time in my rocking chair, garden watering with his tiny can, playful building block sessions on the living room rug. These moments were infused with laughter, affection, and the serenity of boundaries respected. Terrence began to demonstrate gratitude in small but meaningful ways, arriving punctually, thanking me for my time, and engaging in conversation that acknowledged my life beyond being a caregiver. Tiffany, though still slightly formal, began to treat me with cordiality that felt genuine, even if she retained some lingering resentment. For the first time in decades, I was able to love my family on my terms, freely, fully, and without fear of being exploited. Financially, the freedom was transformative. My modest pension no longer needed to stretch to accommodate unnecessary expenses, freeing me to invest in hobbies and small personal luxuries. I joined a senior-focused gym, strengthening my body and reclaiming my confidence. I purchased a new sewing machine, creating garments for myself and neighbors, gaining not just financial independence but also a renewed sense of purpose. My garden flourished as a symbol of the life I had nurtured for myself. Lush tomatoes, vibrant herbs, and flowers that filled my mornings with beauty and calm. Every day, as I tended to my plants and listened to the birds, I felt an almost cinematic satisfaction, a sense that my life was finally my own. Socially, I rediscovered the warmth of chosen companionship. Brenda remained a steadfast friend, offering empathy, conversation, and laughter without demanding sacrifice. Rhonda's visits every few months became a source of intellectual stimulation and joy, allowing me to engage in museum trips, lectures, and book discussions, experiences that reminded me of my capabilities and intellect outside of the role of caregiver or enabler. I learned that the quality of relationships mattered far more than the quantity of people surrounding me, and that selective, loving connections could bring far greater satisfaction than enforced familial presence ever had. Emotionally, I noticed a profound shift in myself. I had reclaimed not just my home but my identity. I slept fully through the night, my blood pressure stabilized, and the chronic stress that had weighed on me for years began to dissolve. Each day became a carefully curated balance of self-care, productive activities, and meaningful engagement with Ezra and my friends. I realized that this peace, this equilibrium, was a hard-earned reward, one that no amount of guilt, threats, or manipulation could ever take away. By standing firm, I had cultivated a life filled with respect, autonomy, and quiet joy, proving to myself that dignity could be reclaimed at any age. The bond one developed with Ezra was perhaps the most heartwarming outcome of reclaiming my life. He entered my world as a curious, bright-eyed infant, full of wonder and innocence, completely unaware of the turbulence that had preceded his arrival. From the very beginning, I established clear boundaries: Sunday afternoons for 2 hours, always at my house, never as an emergency babysitter or unpaid caregiver. This structure allowed our relationship to flourish without resentment. We built small, meaningful routines: reading picture books on the cozy rug by the fireplace, watering the garden together, and making up little songs as we played with blocks. Ezra's laughter became the soundtrack of my newfound freedom, and I learned that love could thrive beautifully within boundaries. Terrence and Tiffany's financial struggles in that first year were relentless. Terrence lost his job at the insurance company, exhausted by sleepless nights and the constant pressure of managing rent and baby expenses. Tiffany returned to work at a low-paying salon, barely covering her share of costs. Their calls for financial help were frequent, and while I listened and offered practical suggestions, moving to a cheaper apartment, taking on additional work, or cutting unnecessary expenses, I no longer felt compelled to bail them out. This was my boundary, my hard line, and enforcing it was an act of love for myself. They were learning the consequences of adult choices, and I was finally free to live my life without constant intrusion. By the second year, their growth became visible. Terrence's new construction job brought stability, teaching him responsibility and the real value of money. Tiffany's income increased, easing some of the pressure, though she remained slightly resentful. Yet these challenges, instead of being a burden to me, became lessons they had to face on their own. Our Sunday visits became a joyful anchor. Ezra's giggles, curiosity, and innocent questions made every effort to maintain boundaries worthwhile. These visits were not marred by manipulation or guilt. They were pure, heartfelt interactions. My own life blossomed during this time. Freed from the demands of running a household for others, I could invest in myself fully. The gym membership strengthened not just my body but my confidence, and sewing became a source of both creativity and modest income. Gardening brought peace, beauty, and satisfaction as I watched my plants grow and thrive under my care. Each morning, sipping coffee in the quiet of my own home, I reveled in the simple joys I had neglected for years. The smell of fresh earth, the song of birds, the warmth of the sun on my skin. These moments, though seemingly small, became the foundation of my reclaimed independence and happiness. Socially, I rediscovered the richness of meaningful connections. Brenda remained a loyal friend, offering companionship without expectation, while Rhonda's visits every few months reminded me of my intellectual capacity and curiosity. Together, we explored museums, attended lectures, and shared deep conversations, all of which reinforced the sense that my life could be intellectually and emotionally fulfilling, independent of the demands of adult children. Through this, I understood that autonomy and chosen connections were infinitely more rewarding than forced, toxic relationships. The transformation in Terrence and Tiffany's behavior over time was subtle but undeniable. Terrence, for the first time in years, arrived on Sundays punctually, expressing genuine gratitude for the time he spent with Ezra. He began to ask about my well-being, my hobbies, and my daily life, not out of obligation, but from a place of genuine curiosity and respect. While he never offered a direct apology for the months of exploitation, his actions spoke volumes. It was as if he had finally grasped the lessons I had been forced to teach through firm boundaries: respect, responsibility, and the value of independence. Tiffany, however, still maintained a veneer of politeness, concealing lingering resentment, but even her interactions were more measured and considerate. Financially, my life improved in ways I hadn't imagined possible. With my pension now solely supporting my own needs, I was able to indulge in small luxuries I had long denied myself. I purchased a new sewing machine that rekindled my passion for creating garments and repairing clothing for neighbors in exchange for small amounts of money, a modest but empowering source of income. My garden, once neglected during the years of serving Terrence and Tiffany, became a sanctuary. I invested in new plants, fresh soil, and tools, and the joy of nurturing life from seed to bloom became an essential part of my daily routine. These were not mere hobbies. They were acts of reclaiming my time, energy, and dignity. One of the most profound changes was in my social life. Brenda remained a steady source of friendship and support, free from the pressures of family obligation. Her wisdom and companionship reminded me that adult friendships could be as nurturing as familial ties. Rhonda's visits reignited intellectual curiosity and emotional connection that I had sacrificed in years of serving Terrence's whims. Together, we explored museums, attended talks, and shared countless hours of laughter and conversation. I rediscovered myself in these moments, not just as a mother, grandmother, or caregiver, but as a woman with passions, thoughts, and desires worthy of attention and respect. Ezra, my grandson, became the heart of my renewed life. Our Sundays together were structured, filled with learning, laughter, and love, all on my terms. Reading books, building with blocks, and nurturing the garden became our rituals. For the first time in decades, my love for family coexisted with my personal autonomy, and I realized that boundaries did not diminish affection, they enhanced it. Watching him grow with curiosity and joy, I found a deep satisfaction in knowing I could shape a meaningful relationship without sacrificing myself. The first seeds of true peace and happiness had been planted. No longer did I feel trapped in a life defined by the demands of others. I was free to pursue my passions, nurture my friendships, and enjoy the unconditional love of my grandson, all while maintaining the boundaries that protected my dignity and well-being. The journey was far from simple, but each day reinforced the value of the choices I had made. As the months passed, the contrast between my life now and the life I had endured with Terrence and Tiffany became increasingly stark. Mornings were no longer dictated by the urgent clatter of pots and pans, or the relentless demands for gourmet breakfasts. Instead, I woke naturally, sometimes to the soft light of dawn, sometimes to the song of birds I had planted years ago. I brewed my coffee just the way I liked it, and for the first time in decades, I savored each sip without guilt, without urgency, without obligation. Even the simplest acts, spreading butter on toast, turning the pages of a novel, or planting seeds in the garden, felt like acts of reclaiming my life. Ezra's visits became the anchor of my weeks, a source of joy that never felt exhausting or exploitative. We created our own little universe in my home, where rules were clear and respect was mutual. He knew, even at his young age, that time with Grandma was precious and intentional. We read stories together, built towers of blocks, and laughed over simple games. In the garden, he learned the names of the plants, helped me water them, and marveled at the growth that came from patience and care. I reveled in these moments not because I had to, but because they were joyful, shared, and meaningful. Terrence and Tiffany, now living in their own apartment, were forced to navigate life with responsibility. Terrence's new job provided stability, yet I watched them struggle with the challenges they had once ignored. Every phone call they made for advice was met with practical guidance rather than financial rescue. I no longer felt the burden of their irresponsibility pressing on my shoulders. Instead, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. They were learning consequences, and I was finally free from emotional manipulation. Financial independence became a powerful symbol of my liberation. My pension, once stretched to cover others' excesses, now provided comfort, security, and freedom. I could afford small pleasures that rejuvenated my spirit. New books, art supplies, occasional outings, and contributions to my own happiness. The simple act of spending money on myself without guilt became an affirmation of my worth. I realized that self-care was not indulgence. It was survival, dignity, and a reclamation of life that had been long deferred. I also began to invest in my health. Gym sessions, yoga, and mindful breathing became rituals that strengthened both body and mind. I felt energy I hadn't experienced in years, and I relished the knowledge that these improvements were my own doing. My life had transformed from one of service, stress, and exploitation into one of autonomy, peace, and intentionality. Each day I felt the weight of past burdens lift, replaced by gratitude, clarity, and the simple joy of being the master of my own home and time. The transformation wasn't just physical or financial. It was deeply emotional. I began to notice the small, quiet victories in my daily life. I no longer flinched at loud voices, no longer felt the oppressive tension of someone's demands pressing down on me. Silence, once a void, had become a sanctuary. I could read, paint, or simply sit by the window and watch the seasons change without interruption. These moments, which might seem mundane to others, were monumental to me. They were proof that I had reclaimed my life, my space, and my dignity. Ezra became the heart of this new rhythm. His laughter echoed through the rooms, but it no longer carried the weight of obligation. When he toddled toward me with a drawing he had made or a story he wanted to tell, I could respond with full attention, fully present, without fatigue or resentment. The time we shared became an unpressured bond of genuine love, rather than a transactional expectation. Watching him grow, I felt pride that wasn't tied to servitude, but to presence, patience, and care freely given. Terrence began to change too, not overnight but gradually. Our Sunday visits became calmer, more respectful. He apologized indirectly, often with thoughtful gestures or by simply showing up on time and contributing to Ezra's care in small, responsible ways. Tiffany's courtesy was more restrained, her smiles polite but guarded. I could see that both of them were adjusting to the consequences of independence, learning responsibility in ways I had tried to teach them but could never enforce while they were living in my house. One of the most profound changes came in the way I viewed myself. For decades, I had defined my worth by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could bear without complaint. I had believed that love meant surrender, and that boundaries were selfishness. But now, each decision I made for myself reinforced a truth I had long ignored. Protecting my dignity and emotional well-being was not betrayal. It was self-respect. Saying no, setting limits, and reclaiming my space was an act of courage and love, not just for me, but for the family I still cared about. My friendships flourished. Brenda, my trusted confidant, became more than a friend. She became a mirror reflecting the woman I had once been and the woman I was becoming. Our lunches were filled with laughter, stories, and genuine connection. We didn't talk about Terrence or Tiffany in judgment or bitterness, but as a reminder of lessons learned and boundaries honored. These relationships, built on mutual respect rather than obligation, reminded me that life could be rich, fulfilling, and joyful even without bending to the demands of those who took more than they gave. The mornings became sacred again. I woke naturally without alarms, without the weight of other people's schedules dictating my day. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the aroma, the warmth, the simple pleasure of having time just for me. I would sit by the window watching the sunlight pour across the garden, listening to the birds, feeling a deep, unshakable peace. These small rituals, once impossible in a house dominated by demands and expectations, now grounded me. They reminded me that freedom isn't just about space. It's about the ability to claim the quiet joys of everyday life for yourself. Ezra thrived in this environment. He learned to anticipate our routines and delighted in the little traditions we created. Reading together, playing with blocks, watering the garden. Each moment was imbued with love, attention, and patience. I could see his personality bloom without the shadow of tension or the pressure of using me as a tool to solve adult problems. I felt pride in being a grandmother, not a servant. I felt joy in teaching him simple lessons: how to care for a plant, how to turn pages in a book, how to express curiosity and wonder, without sacrificing my own energy or peace. Terrence and Tiffany continued to face their own challenges. Living independently forced them to confront the realities of financial responsibility and personal accountability. Late payments, budgeting mistakes, sleepless nights. They learned lessons they had never truly grasped while living under my roof. And yet, through this process, I began to see glimpses of their growth. Terrence, once arrogant and demanding, started showing small acts of consideration. A timely phone call, a thoughtful question about my day, a gentle thank you when I cared for Ezra. These gestures, subtle as they were, spoke volumes. Tiffany's respect remained more reserved, but her demeanor softened when she witnessed my consistency and boundaries. I found myself reflecting often on the power of choice. For so long I had felt trapped, obligated, and exploited by the very people I loved. But now every choice I made was mine. I chose peace over conflict, dignity over humiliation, self-respect over blind obedience. Each decision reinforced my identity, reminding me that love does not require surrender, and care does not necessitate exploitation. I began to understand that the most enduring gift I could give anyone, including my children and grandson, was a model of strength, boundaries, and self-respect. My hobbies and passions flourished. Sewing became not just a pastime but a source of joy and creativity. I invested in a quality machine, creating dresses and mending clothes for neighbors. Gardening became a meditation. Tending to plants, watching them grow, and harvesting fresh vegetables connected me to life in a way I hadn't felt in years. The money I earned from small sewing projects or garden produce added a sense of independence, a tangible reinforcement of the freedom I had fought to reclaim. With each passing week, I noticed subtle changes within myself. The anxiety that had shadowed my every waking hour dissipated, replaced by a sense of clarity and confidence I hadn't felt in decades. The house, once a battleground of tension and resentment, now felt like a sanctuary. Each room, each familiar object, carried the quiet hum of my choices, my comfort, and my dignity. Even the walls seemed to breathe with relief, as if the house itself was glad to have regained its rightful harmony. Sunday visits with Ezra became the highlight of my week. We developed little routines, almost ceremonial in their consistency. I would make his favorite snacks, prepare the little rocking chair, and gather storybooks that had long been tucked away. He would run to me with a bright, open smile, and I would scoop him into my arms, feeling the warmth of love that was genuine, uncomplicated, and free of expectation. These moments reminded me why I had stood firm, why I had reclaimed my home, and why I had insisted on boundaries. I could be present, attentive, and nurturing, but only on terms that respected my own life and well-being. Terrence's occasional calls for advice or small help no longer carried the weight of obligation. I responded with practical guidance, encouraging independence and responsibility, rather than giving in to emotional pressure. It was a delicate balance, remaining supportive as a grandmother and parent without being exploited. But over time, I became adept at navigating it. The gratitude and acknowledgement I received from Terrence, finally rooted in respect and understanding, reinforced the correctness of my choices. My friendships deepened. Brenda became a daily source of laughter, insight, and companionship. We shared our stories, compared experiences, and learned from one another's journeys. Cousin Rhonda's visits brought intellectual stimulation and joy. Our explorations of museums, lectures, and books reminded me that life had richness beyond domestic service and family obligations. These connections, forged in shared understanding and respect, added layers of fulfillment to my life that had been absent for far too long. Financial independence felt transformative. My modest pension, once strained to support others, now allowed me not just survival but pleasure. I saved, traveled, and indulged in small luxuries without guilt. The sense of control over my finances mirrored the control I had reclaimed over my life. Every decision, from grocery shopping to investing in my hobbies, was a choice made freely, without coercion or manipulation. I realized, with a deep sense of satisfaction, that my life was no longer dictated by fear, guilt, or obligation. It was dictated by joy, choice, and the knowledge that I was living authentically, with dignity intact. As the months passed, my routines became rituals of self-care and joy. Mornings were sacred, waking naturally, brewing my favorite coffee, and savoring a quiet moment on the porch while the sunlight kissed the garden. I tended to my plants with meticulous care, watching the vegetables and flowers flourish, knowing that each bloom was a reflection of my newfound freedom. No one dictated my schedule. No one demanded my labor or attention beyond what I freely chose to give. For the first time in decades, I felt the full weight of autonomy, and it was intoxicating. Ezra's laughter became the soundtrack of my renewed life. I watched him discover the world with wonder, helping him plant seeds, reading stories that sparked his imagination, and teaching him simple lessons of kindness and patience. Our bond grew organically, rooted in love but also in respect. I wasn't an unpaid caretaker. I was his grandmother, a guide, and a companion who could choose when and how to engage. The joy of this relationship, untainted by manipulation or coercion, reinforced the wisdom of the eviction. Terrence and Tiffany's struggles no longer consumed me. Their financial missteps, their failed attempts at reconciliation, and their occasional appeals for support were now background noise. I responded calmly and rationally, offering advice but never surrendering to guilt. I saw them grow, not because I pushed them, but because circumstances forced them to face responsibility. Terrence eventually began calling to share small successes at work, and Tiffany occasionally shared Ezra's little milestones. Their gratitude was genuine, subtle, and earned, not demanded. My personal growth extended beyond finances and relationships. I rediscovered hobbies I had shelved, sewing elaborate patterns on my new machine, joining the community gym and finding strength I had forgotten, and even painting canvases that reflected my inner peace. These activities were not chores but expressions of my identity. Estelle, the woman who existed beyond her roles as mother, grandmother, and caretaker. The more I reclaimed my space, my time, and my energy, the more I recognized the profound lesson in all of this. Love does not require sacrifice of self. True love respects boundaries, cherishes dignity, and allows each person to thrive individually. I had spent decades unlearning this lesson, but now I lived it daily with tangible proof in my health, happiness, and harmony. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself sitting in the garden with a cup of tea, watching the golden leaves fall gently around me. The quiet was unlike anything I had experienced in years, and it carried a bittersweet beauty. I thought of Terrence and Tiffany, not with anger or resentment, but with a clear understanding of our roles in each other's lives. They had their path to walk and I had mine. That separation, once so painful, had become the very thing that allowed love to exist without toxicity. Ezra toddled around the garden, clutching his tiny watering can, laughing as he splashed water onto the soil. Watching him reminded me why I had to set boundaries, why I had to reclaim my home and my peace. A mother's love does not mean surrendering one's life to abuse. It means teaching, guiding, and sometimes allowing consequences to shape character. Terrence and Tiffany were learning that now, and Ezra was thriving in an environment free from manipulation, nurtured by both parents, yet able to share joy with me in a way that was healthy and intentional. The realization struck me fully. The moments of silence, the quiet mornings, the undisturbed afternoons were not emptiness, they were freedom. I began documenting my days, writing reflections and letters to myself, acknowledging how far I had come. Each note reinforced my sense of self-worth, the dignity I had fought for, and the power of choice. I realized that reclaiming my home had not only restored my physical space but had rebuilt my soul. Brenda's visits became even more cherished. We shared laughter, our triumphs and struggles, and a mutual understanding that comes only from surviving life's challenges and finding one's own voice. Our conversations were rich with wisdom, humor, and emotional depth. I often thought about how isolated I had been when living under Terrence and Tiffany's demands, and I marveled at how resilience and courage had transformed those years of quiet suffering into a life of intentional happiness. Through these months, I internalized a lesson that no court document or legal action could fully convey. Peace is not given. It is claimed. It is claimed with courage, with firm boundaries, and with a refusal to accept humiliation in the guise of love. Every morning I rose, every page I wrote, every moment I spent with Ezra or in my garden, was a declaration that I belonged to myself first. The world outside could wait, but my dignity could not. Winter arrived softly, coating the neighborhood in a serene blanket of white, and with it came a profound sense of reflection. I found myself sitting by the window, wrapped in a warm shawl, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. The world outside seemed quiet, yet inside my mind hummed with clarity. For the first time in decades, I understood what it meant to live fully for myself, to make choices based on my happiness, my health, and my emotional well-being. Ezra ran across the snow-covered yard, his small boots leaving prints that soon disappeared under fresh flurries. Watching him reminded me of the innocence and joy that life could still hold, even after years of struggle. He represented a new beginning, a bridge between generations where love could exist without the weight of obligation or exploitation. I realized that boundaries were not barriers. They were a framework that allowed relationships to flourish safely. Terrence and Tiffany had adjusted to life on their own, and I observed their growth with a mix of pride and relief. They had learned responsibility, the meaning of hard work, and the consequences of their choices. They still reached out occasionally, now with a genuine respect that had been absent during those long months in my home. I saw the difference between manipulation and authentic connection, and it reinforced why my decision had been so necessary. Brenda stopped by one afternoon with a basket of homemade pastries, and we sat together by the fire, sipping tea and talking about life. Our laughter echoed warmly through the house, a stark contrast to the tension-filled silence of years past. I realized that true friendship, like true family love, required mutual respect, shared joy, and the absence of coercion. These were lessons I had learned painfully, but they had anchored me in a profound understanding of myself. As I continued to nurture my passions, gardening, painting, writing, I felt an inner vitality returning. The garden became not only a source of nourishment, but a metaphor for growth and patience. Each seed planted, each flower tended, was a testament to the care I had begun to give myself. And when Ezra came to visit, our time together was pure and joyful, untainted by manipulation or demands. I was learning that liberation was not simply about reclaiming a house, it was about reclaiming life itself. Spring arrived slowly, bringing with it a sense of renewal that mirrored the transformation in my own life. The sunlight streamed through my kitchen windows, warming the wooden floors and illuminating the small details I had long neglected. The cracks in the walls, the faded curtains, the tiny potted plants that now thrived under my care. Each day I spent tending to my home, I felt a growing pride in the space I had reclaimed, not just as a house, but as a sanctuary of my own making. Ezra's laughter became the soundtrack of my mornings. I watched him chase butterflies in the garden, his small hands brushing over the flowers I had planted months ago. There was a gentle rhythm to our time together, a balance of care and freedom. I read him stories in my rocking chair, letting his imagination soar while maintaining the boundaries I had set. He never arrived to demand attention, and I never felt the weight of obligation. Instead, our connection blossomed naturally, filled with genuine love and joy. Terrence and Tiffany had grown in ways I had long hoped they would. Terrence's job at the construction company gave him a sense of purpose, and Tiffany's new position at the salon taught her the value of consistency and dedication. I watched them navigate the challenges of their adult lives from a distance, offering advice only when asked, and felt a quiet satisfaction knowing they were learning independence the hard way, without using me as a crutch. Brenda and I had become inseparable companions, our Wednesdays sacred. We shared not only our joys but our frustrations, our dreams, and our small victories. With her, I found a companionship that was free from the tension and manipulation I had endured for years. Our conversations reminded me that emotional freedom was just as vital as financial independence, and that nurturing friendships could restore parts of the self long forgotten. I also began exploring my creative side again. My sewing machine hummed steadily as I crafted dresses and repaired old garments, and my small profits gave me a sense of independence I hadn't felt in decades. Painting became a meditative practice. The brush strokes allowed me to express emotions I hadn't been able to articulate. Slowly, my home transformed into a haven of color, life, and creativity, a testament to the resilience of someone who had learned to put herself first. The quiet mornings became my favorite moments. I would sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, the aroma drifting through the room, feeling the soft warmth of sunlight on my face. Those mornings were no longer filled with tension, nagging, or the constant anticipation of demands. They belonged entirely to me, and for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of freedom settle gently on my shoulders. I had reclaimed not just my home, but my time, my energy, and my sense of self. Ezra's visits continued to bring me immense joy, and I cherished each interaction. We developed little traditions that were ours alone. Storytime in my favorite chair, helping him plant seeds in the garden, and baking cookies together every second Sunday. He laughed freely, without the underlying stress I had experienced when Terrence and Tiffany were trying to manipulate me. I realized that love, when given without coercion or expectation, flourished. And I was learning to love him fully on my own terms, without sacrificing my own peace or dignity. Terrence occasionally tried to negotiate or explain himself during our Sunday visits, but his tone had softened. He no longer demanded or expected me to bend to his needs. Instead, he approached me with cautious respect, aware that the boundaries I had set were not up for debate. Even without direct apologies, his actions reflected growth. Tiffany, though quieter and more reserved, began showing genuine courtesy. I noticed her laughter becoming more natural during our conversations, and she no longer spoke with that imperious tone that once made every interaction exhausting. The house itself became a reflection of my inner transformation. I invested in small comforts. A new set of curtains that brought warmth to the living room, fresh flowers that brightened the kitchen, and a comfortable chair by the window where I could read for hours. Each item was a choice I made for myself, a tangible reminder that my needs and happiness mattered. For the first time, I could truly enjoy my home without feeling the invisible weight of someone else's entitlement pressing down on me. Friendships, hobbies, and personal projects became my pillars of happiness. Brenda and I explored new neighborhoods, attended local art exhibits, and exchanged ideas about books and life. Sewing allowed me to express creativity I had long suppressed, and the modest income one earned gave me a sense of empowerment and self-reliance. Gardening became meditative, each seed a symbol of patience and care that mirrored the nurturing I could finally offer myself. The financial independence I had regained brought a profound sense of security. I no longer had to worry about whether my pension would be stretched too thin to accommodate others' irresponsibility. Every dollar I spent now was intentional, a choice that reflected my values and priorities. I started budgeting carefully, setting aside a small emergency fund, and even planning tiny treats for myself, like a new book, a magazine subscription, or a special dinner prepared just for me. These small acts of self-care, which I had long denied myself, felt revolutionary. Terrence and Tiffany's struggles with independence only reinforced my decision. Each call for financial help reminded me that enabling them had never been the solution. When they insisted on expensive lifestyle choices without planning or effort, I responded with practical advice and guidance, rather than monetary support. I realized that my refusal to fund their escapades was not cruelty. It was a lesson in responsibility they needed to learn. Slowly, they began to adjust, discovering the challenges of adult life and the rewards of hard work. Watching them navigate their own path brought a complex sense of satisfaction. I knew I had acted with love, not indulgence, and that my boundaries had taught them more than I could have through endless sacrifice. Our Sunday routines with Ezra became sacred. I marveled at how effortlessly joy filled the space between us. No longer a tool for manipulation, I could be fully present with him, nurturing curiosity, laughter, and warmth. Together, we built a world within my home that was safe, consistent, and full of wonder. Every block tower, every story read aloud, every giggle as we watered the garden reinforced the bond that mattered most. A relationship rooted in love and respect, not obligation. In the evenings, I found solace in quiet reflection. Sitting on the back porch under the stars, I traced the trajectory of my life and recognized the courage it took to reclaim it. The fear of loneliness, once paralyzing, had faded into a serene independence. I realized that solitude was not emptiness, it was freedom. And with freedom came a clarity of purpose, a deeper understanding that my worth was not tied to service or approval, but to the integrity and dignity I upheld every day. Over the months, I noticed subtle but meaningful changes in Terrence and Tiffany. Terrence, once careless and entitled, had grown into a man who understood the value of time, money, and respect. When he visited with Ezra, he was punctual, attentive, and even asked questions about my life, what books I was reading, how my garden was doing, what new hobbies I had taken up. There was a humility in his tone that had been absent before, a quiet acknowledgement that he had taken me for granted. It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it carried the weight of responsibility, a recognition of lessons painfully learned. Tiffany's behavior shifted as well, though more subtly. She no longer demanded my involvement in every aspect of their lives. She maintained a polite distance, yet her conversation began to reflect curiosity about my experiences, my hobbies, and my opinions. Occasionally, she would ask for advice on cooking or decorating, small gestures that hinted at a newfound appreciation for boundaries and independence. While she didn't entirely shed her sense of entitlement, there was enough change to demonstrate that my firm decision had forced growth, not only in their financial responsibility but in their emotional maturity. Ezra became the bridge between us, a living reminder of love without manipulation. Each Sunday, as he arrived with his bright, curious eyes, my heart swelled. We developed rituals that were ours alone, reading stories in the rocking chair, building towers on the living room floor, and tending the garden together. He was free to enjoy my company without me being trapped in the role of unpaid caregiver. Watching him learn and grow under my guidance, I felt an unadulterated joy that no past stress or exploitation could overshadow. These moments reminded me that love could exist without sacrifice at the cost of dignity. I had rediscovered my own worth, and in doing so, I had also created a safe, nurturing environment for Ezra. It was a revelation. One could love deeply, even fiercely, without surrendering one's own life, and that was a lesson both my children and I had needed to understand. The financial lessons Terrence and Tiffany had learned were hard-earned, but they were starting to stick. Terrence finally secured a stable job at a construction company, earning enough to cover rent, bills, and even save a little. Tiffany's salon work brought in additional income, giving them a sense of independence that had been absent for years. There were still struggles, certainly, and occasional arguments over money or schedules, but the difference in attitude was unmistakable. They were no longer reliant on me to bail them out. Instead, they were facing the consequences of their choices, learning to live within their means, and slowly embracing responsibility. I, on the other hand, flourished in the space they had once filled with demands and manipulation. The small luxuries I had long denied myself became a source of comfort and pride. The new sewing machine allowed me to craft beautiful garments for myself and the neighbors, combining pleasure and a modest income. My garden, once neglected, flourished under my care. The mornings I had spent serving others now belonged entirely to me. Watering plants, enjoying the sun, and savoring the simple joys that had been buried under months of servitude. Brenda became more than a friend. She was a companion who shared in my daily triumphs and small victories. Our lunches became sacred moments of connection, free from the constant stress of managing adult children. Conversations with her reminded me that life could be rich and fulfilling without having to sacrifice oneself for the whims of others. With Rhonda's visits every few months, my social and intellectual life revived. We explored museums, shared history books, and engaged in thought-provoking conversations that reminded me of my own intelligence and capability, qualities I had long forgotten while being trapped in a cycle of servitude. I realized that reclaiming my home had been about more than just physical space. It was about reclaiming my time, my energy, and ultimately my identity. The quiet Sundays with Ezra, the laughter shared over sewing projects, and the calm evenings in my garden became the markers of a life finally my own. And through it all, the lessons I had learned about boundaries, self-respect, and the true nature of love became more valuable than anything money could buy. The bond with my grandson Ezra became one of the most precious parts of my life. Every Sunday, he would arrive with bright, curious eyes that seemed to soak in the world with a wonder I had almost forgotten. Our time together was deliberate, structured, and filled with joy. We read books in the rocking chair I had reclaimed as mine, played with blocks on the living room rug, and tended the garden together. I watched him discover the small miracles of life, the feel of soil between his fingers, the sight of a caterpillar on a leaf, the joy of watering plants. In those moments, I felt an immense sense of purpose that was entirely my own. Terrence and Tiffany occasionally tried to coax me into overstepping my boundaries, suggesting I babysit for long hours or provide additional care beyond our agreed-upon schedule. I remained firm, calmly reminding them that my role as grandmother was about love and connection, not unpaid labor. Each time I held my ground, I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a reassurance that my choices mattered, and that respect for my time and well-being was non-negotiable. Ezra learned this rhythm too. He knew the joy of our afternoons was unconditional, yet framed within the boundaries that kept both of us balanced and content. With this newfound autonomy, I explored the interests that had lain dormant for years. Sewing and gardening became not just hobbies, but expressions of freedom. The neighborhood community center classes, the excursions with Brenda and Rhonda, and even the small pleasures of buying books or treating myself to a coffee became markers of a life I had long deferred to others. For the first time in decades, I could structure my life around my own desires, and not the whims of those who had once exploited my generosity. I often reflected on the immense difference between my life before and after the eviction. Before, my days had been consumed by anxiety, servitude, and the unspoken demands of entitlement. Now every choice I made was deliberate, every moment filled with self-respect and gratitude for the freedom I had reclaimed. And in these reflections, I began to understand that the true gift of that difficult decision was not only the peace in my home, but the profound reawakening of my own sense of self. Terrence's transformation over time was slow but unmistakable. During our Sunday visits, I began to notice subtle changes in the way he treated me. He arrived on time, no longer rushing in with a sense of entitlement. He thanked me sincerely for my time with Ezra, asked about my health, my hobbies, and even my small triumphs in the garden. It wasn't a grand apology, nor an overt declaration of guilt, but a quiet recognition that he had once taken for granted the boundaries and generosity I had set. Each polite word and thoughtful gesture was a small reminder that growth often comes through consequence, and that respect must be earned, not demanded. Tiffany, on the other hand, remained cautious in her warmth. She smiled and conversed, yet her courtesy carried traces of lingering resentment. Still, I could see signs of change in her as well. She began participating in our discussions beyond the care of Ezra, asking about recipes, sharing stories of work, and even expressing interest in my sewing projects. These small interactions were powerful markers of progress, showing me that even those who resist boundaries for years can adapt when consequences are firm and consistent. My own life, in parallel, blossomed in ways I had long forgotten were possible. The financial independence I regained allowed me to indulge in little joys that had been impossible, while sustaining two adults who refused to take responsibility. Gym sessions brought both physical and emotional strength. Sewing gave me a creative outlet and modest income, and gardening offered a meditative refuge where I could nurture life without anyone's demands overshadowing my intentions. I realized that the slow rhythm of tending plants, watching flowers bloom, and harvesting vegetables was more fulfilling than the chaotic stress of fulfilling someone else's expectations. Most importantly, I understood that the freedom I had reclaimed wasn't merely about removing people from my house. It was about reclaiming my own agency, my dignity, and my right to live life on my terms. The decision that had seemed so harsh at the moment, evicting my son and his wife, revealed itself as an act of deep self-preservation, an essential step toward the serenity and fulfillment I now experienced. Ezra's presence in my life became a source of pure joy, a reminder that love can exist without obligation or exploitation. Our Sundays together were sacred, 2 hours that belonged entirely to us, filled with laughter, storytelling, and gentle routines that we both cherished. I watched him grow, noticing the subtle ways he mirrored his father's curiosity and his mother's determination, yet unburdened by the entitlement that had overshadowed Terrence and Tiffany for so long. Every time he smiled at me or showed excitement over a new block tower or a freshly watered plant, I felt a warmth in my chest that no money or gift could replace. Terrence began to show responsibility in ways that once seemed impossible. He learned to balance work, parenting, and the obligations of his small apartment without depending on me for emotional or financial crutches. The lessons he had avoided for decades became unavoidable realities, and with each small success, I sensed a maturity forming in him that could not have been forced. He began to understand that respect and gratitude are earned, and that neglecting the welfare of those who nurtured you carries consequences. Tiffany, too, started to adjust. While she still held some resentment for the hardships they faced post-eviction, she gradually recognized that my firm boundaries had created a stable foundation for our new interactions. I, for my part, thrived in a rhythm that had been long denied me. Mornings of quiet reflection, coffee in hand, were my sanctuary. Afternoons were devoted to hobbies and small indulgences that nourished my sense of self. Reading novels in the sunlight, tending to my garden, experimenting with sewing projects, and even planning small trips with friends. Financially, the burden I had carried for years lifted entirely. My modest pension allowed me comfort, independence, and even a modest savings account for emergencies. Each decision I made was a declaration that my life, my house, and my time were mine to cherish. The evolution of my household was both external and internal. The absence of constant demands and disrespect allowed space for my emotional health to flourish. Anxiety eased, sleep deepened, and a sense of peace enveloped me that had been absent for years. I began to understand deeply and fully that reclaiming my home and setting firm boundaries was not cruelty, but the most profound act of love for myself, and paradoxically for my family, who now had the chance to learn accountability without exploiting me. Ezra's laughter became a melody that echoed through my home, turning rooms once filled with tension into spaces of joy. His curiosity about the world was boundless. Each Sunday I watched him discover small wonders, the texture of leaves, the sound of birdsong, the way sunlight danced on the walls. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, not as a servant or caretaker, but as a loving grandmother who could guide, teach, and enjoy without resentment. For the first time in decades, I experienced the fullness of my role as a matriarch on my own terms, a position of dignity and love rather than subjugation. Terrence's transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. He began arriving on time, no longer making excuses, no longer leaning on manipulation or guilt. I noticed the subtle changes in his tone of voice, the way he acknowledged my time and presence, the small gestures of courtesy that had been absent for years. He had discovered the hard truths of adult life, the necessity of financial responsibility, the value of punctuality, and the importance of honoring one's word. Tiffany, while still guarded, started to engage with me in genuine conversations, discussing her work, her ambitions, and even simple pleasures like cooking or books she had read. The walls that had been built over months of entitlement and manipulation began to crumble, replaced by cautious respect and a willingness to coexist without exploitation. My own life flourished in tandem. The days were mine to shape and savor. I invested in my passions, from sewing and gardening to painting and exploring local cultural events. Friendships deepened. Brenda became a confidant, a fellow witness to the joys and challenges of aging, offering companionship without demands. Cousin Rhonda's visits brought intellectual stimulation and laughter, bridging years of distance with shared interests and heartfelt connection. I learned that independence was not merely financial. It was emotional, spiritual, and psychological. Reclaiming my autonomy allowed me to thrive in every dimension of life, cultivating joy and fulfillment that had been impossible under the weight of constant demands. The most profound realization was understanding the nature of love and responsibility. Love does not require self-erasure. Caring for family does not necessitate surrendering one's dignity. True connection is nurtured by respect, boundaries, and mutual recognition of each other's humanity. Ezra, innocent and unburdened, became a living testament to this principle, showing that nurturing relationships with the right boundaries produces joy, not resentment. Each moment with him reminded me that the hardest decisions, standing firm, setting limits, reclaiming one's life, ultimately yield the deepest rewards. The years of quiet, deliberate self-reclamation transformed not only my home but my inner world. I began to notice the subtle rhythms of life that had once gone unnoticed, the hum of morning birds, the aroma of fresh coffee curling through the kitchen, the warmth of sunlight spilling across the floor as I sat in my favorite chair. Each simple pleasure felt amplified, a gentle affirmation that life could be rich, even in solitude. I realized that happiness did not require approval from others, nor did it demand constant service to those who had once taken me for granted. Sunday afternoons with Ezra became sacred rituals, moments of pure connection unmarred by obligations or resentment. I watched him grow, learning language, curiosity, and empathy, and I marveled at the gift of being able to witness these milestones on my terms. There were days when Terrence or Tiffany tried to insert financial worries into these moments, asking for advice or subtly hinting at assistance, but I had grown confident in my ability to protect both my space and my serenity. My no had become a shield, safeguarding not just my home but the joy that came with truly living on my own terms. Financial independence, once a distant dream, became a living reality. The modest pension I relied upon, once strained under the weight of others' needs, now allowed me freedom. I could choose where to spend, what to save, and how to invest in my passions. My sewing, gardening, and painting were not just hobbies. They were expressions of autonomy, each stitch, each brushstroke, each seed planted, a reclamation of the life I had nearly lost. Friendships grew, laughter returned, and I realized that the emotional wealth I had once sacrificed for others could now enrich my own life fully. The transformation in Terrence and Tiffany, though incomplete, was evident. Terrence showed genuine glimpses of maturity, understanding, and appreciation, though I remained vigilant, recognizing the lingering shadows of entitlement. Tiffany's politeness, though often fragile, had evolved into true respect, and our conversations no longer revolved solely around obligations or demands. Together, they were learning the lessons that I had imposed through boundaries, lessons they might have resisted had I not held firm. Their growth became a mirror of my own, proof that strength, patience, and clarity can guide even the most difficult relationships toward healthier forms of connection. As my 73rd birthday arrived, I welcomed it with a quiet reverence that felt almost miraculous. For the first time in decades, the day was entirely mine. A cup of freshly brewed coffee steamed beside me, its aroma mingling with the faint scent of birthday cake I had purchased solely for myself. There were no demands, no obligations, no uninvited pressures. Only the gentle rhythm of my own breathing and the deep satisfaction of knowing that every choice, every moment belonged to me. It was a celebration not only of years but of reclaimed dignity and personal freedom. The arrival of my grandson Ezra, for months after the eviction, brought a new chapter into my life, one of joy, love, and deliberate boundaries. From the moment Tiffany announced her pregnancy, I set clear, unwavering rules for my role. Sunday afternoons for 2 hours at my home, with no expectation of being a full-time caregiver. Every attempt by Terrence and Tiffany to coerce me into unpaid labor, offering me a meager $150 per week for 40 hours of childcare, was met with firm refusal. I could see the lessons unfolding, not only for them but for Ezra, who would grow up understanding that love did not come at the cost of exploitation. The first year of Ezra's life tested their ability to adapt. Terrence lost his insurance job due to lateness and exhaustion, while Tiffany returned to a low-paying salon position. Together, they scraped by on $1,400 a month, barely covering rent, utilities, food, and baby expenses. Each call for assistance was met with practical advice rather than financial rescue. Move to a cheaper apartment, find part-time work, eliminate unnecessary spending, sell the sports car still costing them $700 a month. The lessons of independence, though harsh, were essential. They forced Terrence and Tiffany to confront responsibility for the first time in their adult lives. By the second year, a remarkable transformation began. Terrence secured a stable construction job earning $1,000 per week, while Tiffany improved her income to $300 weekly. They learned to live within their means, and slowly their attitude toward me shifted. Sunday visits became punctual, courteous, and filled with genuine gratitude, particularly from Terrence, who began asking about my life beyond the role of caregiver. Tiffany's politeness remained somewhat forced, yet even she began conversations beyond Ezra, hinting at the possibility of a healthier dynamic. These changes were not apologies for past transgressions, but they reflected growth born from boundaries and accountability. My personal life flourished as well. Freed from the weight of supporting two dependent adults, I invested in myself. My health, my hobbies, my social connections. I joined a senior-friendly gym, forming friendships and building strength, both physical and emotional. My sewing machine, once a tool of necessity, became an instrument of creativity and small-scale independence, allowing me to earn modest income while nurturing my artistic side. Gardening, painting, reading, and reconnecting with friends became daily affirmations of a life lived deliberately, not dictated by others' selfish demands. My mornings, once consumed by the demands of others, became sacred rituals of self-care and joy. I would wake naturally, without the pressure of preparing elaborate breakfasts for Terrence and Tiffany. Instead, I nurtured my own spirit, watering the garden, listening to birdsong, reading novels that transported me to distant worlds, and savoring each sip of my morning coffee as if it were liquid freedom. Each day became a reminder of how profoundly simple and beautiful life could be when lived on my own terms. The relationship with Ezra evolved beautifully within the boundaries I had set. Sundays became sacred, filled with laughter, discovery, and genuine connection. We developed small rituals, reading stories in my rocking chair, building block towers on the living room rug, and tending the garden together. He learned to see me as his loving grandmother, not as a replacement parent or unpaid caretaker. The joy I felt in these moments was authentic and untainted by resentment, and for the first time, I felt the fullness of love without the shadow of exploitation. Over time, Terrence and Tiffany began to internalize the lessons they had once resisted. 6 months ago, Terrence surprised me with a candid conversation. After Ezra had fallen asleep in my arms, he admitted that he now understood the reasons behind my decision to evict them. He spoke of responsibility, of fairness, and of how my steadfast boundaries had forced them to mature into accountable adults. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement of the truth that my decision had been necessary and just. Even Tiffany, while more reserved in her expressions, showed a subtle yet sincere respect. Conversations expanded beyond the child, touching on books, recipes, and personal interests. The shift was tangible. I was no longer defined solely by my sacrifices for their comfort, but recognized as a full person, a grandmother with her own life, passions, and dignity. This transformation, both in them and in me, was the result of unwavering boundaries and the courage to say no, even when it felt emotionally impossible. As I reflected on these past 2 years, the depth of my personal liberation became clear. I had rediscovered my identity beyond the role of the self-sacrificing mother. For decades, my worth had been measured by how much I gave, how much I endured. Now, I understood that my well-being and dignity were equally vital. Setting limits was not cruelty, it was self-respect. Choosing solitude over toxic company was not loneliness, it was life reclaimed. And teaching my children in the most difficult way, that love cannot exist without boundaries, was perhaps the most profound gift I could offer, not only to myself but to my grandson Ezra. My financial independence deepened the sense of freedom I had reclaimed. With Terrence and Tiffany no longer draining my resources, I could live within my modest means and still indulge in small joys. I continued to save $100 each month, a buffer that gave me security and confidence. I treated myself to simple luxuries that once seemed frivolous. A new novel, a vibrant bouquet of flowers for my table, or a special treat from the bakery. Each small purchase became a celebration of my autonomy, a reminder that my life now belonged entirely to me. The garden, once a neglected corner of my home, flourished under my care. Planting new herbs and vegetables became a meditative act, a metaphor for the life I was cultivating for myself. The tomatoes and lettuce grew robustly, the scent of fresh soil grounding me in the satisfaction of tangible achievements. Ezra's small hands learned to care for the plants alongside me, and his curiosity and laughter filled the space with a lightness I had long forgotten. In these moments, I realized that nurturing life could be joyful, not burdensome, and that guiding a child's curiosity could exist without the weight of exploitation. My health also rebounded. The stress that had once tightened my chest and interrupted my sleep was gone, replaced with restful nights and energized mornings. Exercise, yoga, and quiet reflection became daily rituals. Each stretch and each moment of mindfulness reminded me that my body and mind deserved care, that they were instruments of a life lived on my terms, not tools to serve the endless demands of others. I began to feel a vibrancy I hadn't known since before Terrence and Tiffany moved in. A vitality that came from reclaiming both my home and my self-respect. Visits with Brenda became weekly lifelines of friendship and shared laughter. We compared stories of raising children, reflected on our past sacrifices, and celebrated our newfound independence. Hearing her stories of her son, once irresponsible but now thriving, gave me hope that Terrence and Tiffany might continue to grow. But more importantly, it reinforced that my choice had been right. I was no longer responsible for correcting the mistakes of adult children. My role had shifted, finally, to one of genuine connection rather than servitude. In these weeks and months, I discovered an astonishing truth. The quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming my home and setting boundaries had allowed me to rediscover the woman I had been before the weight of endless obligation had dulled my spirit. I felt alive, proud, and serene in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel for decades. And with Ezra, I experienced a love that was pure, joyful, and reciprocal. A love that nourished me rather than depleted me. The relationship with Ezra became one of the greatest joys of my life. Every Sunday, I awaited his arrival with anticipation, preparing small activities that would delight him without ever feeling like a burden. We read storybooks together, his tiny fingers tracing the illustrations as he repeated new words. We built towers from colorful blocks, laughing when they toppled and celebrating small victories when he managed to stack them high. Watering the garden became a shared ritual. I handed him a small watering can, and we carefully nourished the plants together. These moments were simple, but they were profound. I realized that love could flourish within boundaries, that guiding a child's curiosity and nurturing his spirit could exist without personal sacrifice beyond my willingness and joy. Terrence and Tiffany's behavior continued to evolve, albeit slowly. Terrence's punctuality and attentiveness during visits reflected a subtle, but genuine recognition of my worth. He no longer treated me as someone to manipulate, and while his apologies remained unspoken, his actions conveyed respect. Tiffany, more reserved in her acknowledgement, still carried traces of resentment, but she began to converse with me on topics that transcended Ezra and household logistics. We shared discussions about work, books, and cooking, forming the beginnings of a relationship built on civility and mutual acknowledgement, rather than entitlement and coercion. My personal growth, however, extended far beyond my interactions with my family. I enrolled in a local sewing class, investing in a high-quality machine and indulging in a passion I had set aside for too long. Creating dresses for neighbors and friends provided both a modest income and a profound sense of fulfillment. I joined a gym for older adults, finding both physical health and a social community that reinforced my independence and confidence. Gardening, sewing, reading, and social connections became the pillars of a life I had once thought impossible. Full, autonomous, and deeply satisfying. Financially, the contrast to my past obligations was stark. No longer was I supporting two adults who refused to manage their own responsibilities. My modest pension, once stretched thin, now allowed for careful budgeting, small indulgences, and even saving for emergencies. Each dollar I spent was a deliberate choice, a reaffirmation of the life I had reclaimed. I no longer experienced the guilt or anxiety that had plagued me when every cent seemed to disappear into the needs of others. I felt free, empowered, and validated in the decision to assert my boundaries. Perhaps the most subtle yet profound change was internal. I had learned that love and care for my children did not require the annihilation of my own identity. Setting limits, saying no, and defending my dignity were acts of love for myself, not betrayals of my family. I understood that true strength often comes in quiet, firm decisions, in holding space for oneself amidst the chaos and demands of others. And in that understanding I found peace, a deep, unshakable peace that no manipulation or guilt could ever take away. Ezra's laughter became the soundtrack of my Sundays. Watching him explore, ask questions, and discover the world around him filled me with a joy I hadn't known in decades. Every little milestone, stacking blocks, learning new words, even spilling water while helping in the garden, felt monumental because I was witnessing it without being pressured or manipulated. I realized that this was the essence of being a grandmother, sharing love and guidance without sacrificing my own boundaries or sense of self. The innocence of a child became a mirror for my own regained freedom, reflecting a life I had fought to reclaim. Terrence's maturity, though gradual, became evident in his words and actions. One afternoon, while Ezra napped in my arms, Terrence sat quietly beside me, confessing how much he had reflected on the past. He acknowledged the strain he had caused me and expressed, in his own way, gratitude for the boundaries I had enforced. It wasn't a full apology, but it was honest, and for the first time I felt a true sense of accountability. Tiffany, while less expressive, joined in the conversation with cautious cordiality, sharing small acknowledgments and asking genuine questions about my life outside the household. Their behavior signaled a shift from entitlement to recognition, from manipulation to respect. I devoted more time to myself than ever before. Mornings, once consumed by preparing meals for ungrateful adults, were now spent tending my garden, reading novels, and enjoying the sunlight streaming through my kitchen window. The gym became a sanctuary, a place where physical strength reinforced mental resilience. Sewing classes reignited a passion I had long neglected, and small commissions from neighbors provided both income and a sense of accomplishment. Every moment spent on these activities was a declaration. I existed for myself, not to serve the whims of others. Financial independence reinforced my emotional autonomy. With my pension, modest savings, and careful budgeting, I could afford small luxuries, new books, art supplies, trips with friends, that had previously seemed unattainable. Last year, I joined a 4-day trip to the mountains with friends from the community center, immersing myself in nature and laughter without guilt. These experiences, though small in the grand scale, were monumental in reclaiming a life that had been overshadowed by responsibility for adults who refused to be accountable. Most importantly, I discovered the quiet, yet profound strength of my voice. Saying no, enforcing boundaries, and refusing to be exploited were not acts of selfishness. They were acts of survival, dignity, and self-love. I realized that motherhood and love did not require the obliteration of one's own life. I could nurture, guide, and share joy with Ezra while preserving my own peace. And in that balance, I discovered a life richer, fuller, and more meaningful than any I had lived while bending to the unreasonable demands of others. Sundays with Ezra became sacred rituals. We created little traditions that belonged entirely to us. I would prepare a simple snack, and we would sit in my favorite rocking chair as he clutched a small storybook, his tiny fingers tracing the letters as I read aloud. Later, we would water the garden together, his laughter mingling with the birdsong, each droplet of water, a small lesson in care, patience, and observation. These moments reminded me that love doesn't have to be draining or conditional. It can be joyous, gentle, and mutually enriching. Terrence and Tiffany's attempts to manipulate me slowly faded, replaced by a subtle, almost respectful distance. They began to manage their lives with a seriousness they had never shown when living under my roof. Financial decisions were made carefully, schedules adhered to, and the sports car, once a symbol of their entitlement, was sold to relieve their burden. Their struggles were now their own to face, and while I felt empathy, I no longer felt guilt or obligation. My role had transformed from unpaid caretaker to supportive grandmother, and the difference in energy was remarkable. I found freedom in ordinary routines that once felt mundane or impossible. Breakfast was mine to enjoy in peace. I read newspapers without interruption, sipped my coffee slowly, and watched the sunrise without racing to prepare elaborate meals for others. Afternoons were devoted to sewing, gardening, and painting classes. Each stitch, each brushstroke was an assertion of self-worth, a reminder that I could create beauty, care for life, and invest in myself without shame. These small acts of independence became profound celebrations of autonomy and identity. Friendships flourished like never before. Brenda remained a loyal companion, sharing meals, laughter, and advice. Rhonda's visits were filled with stimulating conversations about history, literature, and life itself. These connections reminded me that relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care were infinitely more rewarding than those rooted in obligation or exploitation. Social interactions no longer carried the weight of guilt. They were a choice, freely given and gratefully received. The financial security I reclaimed allowed me to plan for contingencies without fear. My $1,000 pension, combined with careful saving, provided a cushion for unexpected expenses, medical needs, and small pleasures. The liberation from funding others' irresponsibility brought not just economic relief, but emotional calm. I could live without constant anxiety, knowing my resources supported my needs, not the whims of those who had once taken advantage of me. Every dollar saved was a token of regained autonomy, a small but powerful declaration that my life was mine to manage. Ezra's presence became a beacon of joy, a pure connection untainted by past manipulation. He ran into my arms each Sunday, his little feet pattering across the floor with uncontainable excitement. We established rituals that honor both our needs: story time in the rocking chair, coloring sessions at the kitchen table, and afternoons tending to the garden. I taught him how to plant seeds carefully, how to water without washing away the soil, and how to watch patiently as life slowly unfolded. In return, he gifted me laughter, curiosity, and a sense of purpose that was entirely voluntary and heartwarming. Terrence occasionally tried to test the boundaries I had set. He suggested extra visits, offered me small gifts, or tried to present his growing maturity as a reason to reintegrate into my daily life. But I remained steadfast. I knew that love without boundaries could be destructive, and I had learned through years of emotional labor that my well-being was non-negotiable. My house was my sanctuary, my time my own, and I could finally feel the freedom that comes from living without constant exploitation or guilt. My own identity flourished in ways I hadn't imagined. Mornings began with meditation, gentle stretches, or a quiet cup of coffee in the sunlit kitchen. Sewing projects, once sidelined for the demands of others, became my creative outlet. Painting classes allowed me to explore colors, textures, and forms as expressions of my inner world. I discovered an unexpected delight in small indulgences: a new book, a fragrant candle, or a spontaneous walk through the neighborhood. These choices, once impossible, now represented personal sovereignty and joy. Relationships with friends and family deepened. Brenda and I continued our Wednesday lunches, sharing laughter, stories, and wisdom. Rhonda's quarterly visits became moments of intellectual stimulation and heartfelt reconnection. These interactions reminded me that chosen companionship, relationships built on equality, respect, and shared interests, was infinitely more fulfilling than family ties based on obligation, guilt, or exploitation. Financial independence reinforced this newfound peace. My careful budgeting allowed me to save a modest sum each month, providing security and flexibility. I could plan small trips, indulge in hobbies, and even treat myself to occasional luxuries without guilt. I no longer bore the financial burden of adult children who refused responsibility. Every coin saved was a testament to my autonomy and a tangible reinforcement of the boundaries I had fought so hard to maintain. Terrence's slow transformation was subtle but noticeable. He began to show responsibility in ways that once seemed unimaginable. He paid bills on time, maintained his job at the construction company with diligence, and gradually understood the consequences of past negligence. When he visited with Ezra, he was calmer, more considerate, and began to acknowledge the effort I had made in reclaiming my life. Although he never openly apologized for the months of exploitation, his actions spoke volumes. Respect, even when quietly given, carries more weight than hollow words. Tiffany, while still less expressive, began to adjust her demeanor. Conversations grew less confrontational. She offered small gestures of kindness, like helping me tidy the living room during visits or listening attentively when I shared stories. Our interactions were cautious, built on mutual recognition that boundaries existed and must be honored. Slowly, the tension that had defined the previous 2 years began to dissipate. My house, once a battlefield of manipulation and emotional coercion, became a space of controlled, mindful interactions. Ezra, unaware of the complexities surrounding him, flourished in this environment. He thrived in predictable routines, understood the joy of focused attention, and developed a deep connection with me that was both loving and balanced. We celebrated little milestones together. The first time he rode a tricycle without training wheels, learning the alphabet, planting spring flowers, or baking cookies. These moments, free from the shadows of coercion or stress, became treasures that reinforced my sense of purpose and joy. I also noticed a profound internal change in myself. The chronic stress and anxiety that had dominated my life for years slowly melted away. Sleep returned, uninterrupted and restorative. My blood pressure normalized, and my energy levels increased. Activities that had been abandoned, gardening, painting, sewing, now brought pure pleasure. Each day was a reaffirmation of autonomy and dignity, a testament to the power of setting firm boundaries and reclaiming control over one's own life. This was not merely a story of eviction or resistance, it was a story of reclaiming agency, of learning that love does not mean surrendering one's life to the whims of others. I discovered that protecting oneself is an act of courage, and that self-respect can coexist with love. The woman I had been, exhausted, manipulated, and constantly pleasing, was replaced by a woman who lived intentionally, who cherished her time, and who understood that her worth was independent of anyone else's approval. Over time, I began to notice the subtle ways my newfound freedom enriched every aspect of my life. Mornings, once dominated by the frantic preparation of breakfast and household chores for Terrence and Tiffany, now began with quiet reflection. I brewed my coffee slowly, inhaling the rich aroma, and savored each sip as if it were a small ceremony of self-respect. The sunlight spilling through the kitchen window felt different, warmer, welcoming, a reminder that this was my space, my time, my life. I threw myself into activities I had neglected for decades. My sewing machine hummed steadily as I created dresses, repaired clothes for neighbors, and even experimented with embroidery designs that had lived only in my imagination until now. Gardening became not just a hobby but a meditation. Planting seeds, tending to the soil, and watching life emerge under my care was deeply fulfilling. The birds returned to my backyard, their songs a daily soundtrack to a life rebuilt on autonomy and peace. Visits from friends and family, once sparse and fraught with awkwardness, now brought genuine joy. Brenda's presence was comforting, a grounding friendship built on shared experiences rather than obligation. Rhonda's visits rekindled a love for intellectual conversation that had been buried under years of stress. Together, we explored museums, attended lectures, and discussed books. Activities that reminded me of the person I had always been beyond the roles of mother or caregiver. Even Terrence and Tiffany's relationship with me evolved. Their Sunday visits became predictable and respectful. Terrence arrived on time, engaged meaningfully with Ezra, and acknowledged my efforts with quiet gratitude. Tiffany, though slower to shift, showed signs of understanding the boundaries I had set, even offering small gestures of consideration during our interactions. These changes were not dramatic or theatrical. They were subtle shifts, proof that accountability and experience can gradually teach responsibility. Financially, I felt empowered in a way I hadn't in decades. My modest pension, once stretched thin to cover 3 adults, now allowed me to live comfortably, save a small amount each month, and indulge in personal joys without guilt. Small luxuries, magazines, books, art supplies became affirmations of my independence. I realized that my life no longer revolved around rescuing others from the consequences of their own decisions. It revolved around nurturing myself, my home, and the meaningful relationships I chose to cultivate. The mornings now hold a serenity I hadn't felt in decades. I wake up slowly, letting the sun filter through the curtains, savoring the warmth on my face, the quiet that no longer carries tension or demands. The house breathes with me. Each corner, each piece of furniture, no longer feels like a stage for someone else's entitlement or manipulation. Ezra's laughter has become the gentle rhythm of my Sundays, a joy that is fully mine to witness and cherish. Watching him explore the world with curiosity reminds me how vital boundaries are for love to flourish. I see Terrence and Tiffany navigating parenthood with their own hard-earned lessons, realizing that independence isn't just financial, it's emotional too. Their struggles, while challenging, are now theirs to confront, not mine to manage. And I have learned that stepping back doesn't mean stepping away from love. It means protecting it from being exploited. Each Sunday, as Ezra toddles into my arms, his tiny hands reaching for mine, I feel the profound beauty of being a grandmother on my terms. The kitchen no longer smells of obligations I didn't choose, but of fresh bread and coffee I made for myself, a ritual of my autonomy. I sit at the table, book in hand, sometimes glancing at the garden where Marcus and I planted those trees years ago. Their branches have grown strong, much like my resolve, and I smile at the realization that life, even after betrayal, can be reclaimed in its own gentle, patient way. The quiet moments in the garden have become sacred to me. I kneel in the soil, planting seeds I know will bloom in their own time, much like the new chapters of my life. The roses, tomatoes, and herbs are no longer just plants. They are symbols of patience, care, and the nurturing of something that grows because I choose to tend to it, not because anyone demanded it. Each morning I sip my coffee while listening to the birds sing, feeling the rhythm of a life that finally belongs to me. The echoes of past arguments and manipulation fade further into the background. Terrence and Tiffany call occasionally, not for handouts or chores, but to share milestones in Ezra's life. I listen, proud and attentive, but my boundaries remain firm. I have learned that love is most profound when it is free from coercion. I remember the countless mornings I woke before dawn, cooking elaborate breakfasts, serving with a forced smile while feeling resentment simmer inside me. That resentment has dissolved into clarity. I understand now that protecting my dignity was the only path to reclaiming peace. The small pleasures, a new book, a leisurely walk, or a quiet evening with Brenda discussing life's mysteries, have taken on a richness I never expected. Even my sewing projects, once neglected, have become a source of joy and independence. I create not out of obligation but out of desire. And as I watch Ezra stack blocks or water the garden, I realize that the lessons of my life, the courage to say no, the wisdom to set boundaries, the strength to reclaim my home, are lessons I can now pass on gently to the next generation. There are evenings when I sit on my back porch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, and I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for my reclaimed home, for the quiet strength I discovered within myself, and for the clarity that comes from living according to my own rules. The memories of past manipulation, the endless demands, and the silent humiliation no longer hold power over me. I think of Terrence and Tiffany, not with anger, but with recognition of the lessons they inadvertently taught me. By forcing me to confront my own limits and to assert my needs, they helped me reclaim a life I had forgotten I deserved. Ezra's laughter drifts across the living room, a pure sound that fills the house with joy without expectation. I watch him and I see not just my grandson, but the embodiment of a future where boundaries are respected and love is freely given. I sip my evening tea, reflecting on how my days have transformed, from a schedule dictated by others' needs to a rhythm I orchestrate myself. I volunteer at the community center now, teaching painting classes to older women who, like me, are discovering that life after exploitation can be full of creativity, connection, and self-respect. My friendships flourish. Brenda is my steadfast companion in laughter and support. Rhonda's visits bring warmth, intellect, and shared curiosity. Even Denise, my neighbor, has become a joyful presence in the garden, offering conversation that feels effortless and genuine. For the first time in decades, my home feels like my sanctuary, a space where I am fully myself without compromise. I have learned that self-respect is not selfish. It is survival. And the most profound gift we can give ourselves and those around us is a model of healthy boundaries, independence, and dignity. Ezra's presence is a gentle reminder of the beauty of balance. I no longer live in fear of being overrun by the demands of others, and yet I can still nurture love and connection, in a way that is meaningful and joyful. Every Sunday when he arrives with his bright eyes and curious questions, I feel the warmth of a bond built on respect and choice, rather than obligation. We read together, build towers with blocks and water the garden. And in those moments I feel a sense of fulfillment I never experienced when Terrence and Tiffany lived in my home. I realize now that my love as a grandmother does not need to be measured in sacrifice or exhaustion. It can flourish within boundaries that protect my dignity. Financial independence has become a source of quiet empowerment. My pension, which once felt meager when shared with freeloaders, now supports a life of comfort and small joys. I save for emergencies, indulge in hobbies that feed my soul, and travel occasionally to places that bring me peace and inspiration. Each decision I make, whether it's a new plant in the garden or a book to enjoy in solitude, reinforces that I am the author of my own story. Terrence and Tiffany's journey toward responsibility has been slow but undeniable. They face the consequences of their choices, learning to manage their finances, maintain a household, and care for Ezra without relying on me as a safety net. Their independence, once a source of tension, is now a testament to the lessons I enforced with courage and consistency. I reflect on how far I have come, not just in reclaiming my home, but in reclaiming my life, my identity, and my peace. I am Estelle Clark, a woman who has learned that self-respect, dignity, and love for oneself are the foundation of all meaningful relationships. The quiet mornings now feel like a gentle symphony of freedom. I wake naturally without alarms or the pressure to prepare elaborate breakfasts for ungrateful adults. My coffee is hot just the way I like it, and the cake I occasionally treat myself to is a simple pleasure, untainted by expectation or obligation. The house, once a battlefield of manipulation and demands, is now a sanctuary of calm. I can sit in my favorite chair, read, or simply listen to the birds singing outside my window. Every corner of the house carries a sense of ownership and comfort that was absent during the long months of servitude. Ezra's laughter fills the rooms on Sundays, a sound that brings light without burden. His curiosity, his innocence, and his genuine affection are untainted by manipulation. I am present for him fully, yet I am not consumed by his parents' past mistakes. The boundaries I establish protect both my well-being and the quality of our interactions. I see Terrence's growth slowly emerging in his eyes and demeanor. There is a new respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the errors of the past, and a willingness to assume responsibility for his life and family. Tiffany, though still reserved, demonstrates a grudging acceptance of boundaries, understanding that my support is loving but not exploitable. The sense of control I have reclaimed over my own life is exhilarating. I can plan my days according to my own desires, gardening, painting, sewing, social visits, and not according to the whims of those who once demanded everything from me without gratitude. I have come to realize that true love for my children does not mean sacrificing my dignity or peace. It means teaching them accountability and self-reliance, even if it is difficult to enforce. The transformation in my life is not only external but deeply internal. I feel a serenity that I haven't experienced in decades. The tension that once gripped my chest every morning, anticipating demands or conflicts, has dissolved. I can spend hours in my garden, tending to my plants and feeling a sense of accomplishment as tomatoes ripen and herbs flourish. Each moment of quiet is a gift, a reminder that I no longer live under the shadow of entitlement or manipulation. Financially, I am stable and independent, a freedom I hadn't realized I had lost. The small savings I now accumulate feel like proof of my autonomy, a tangible symbol of control over my life. Socially, my relationships have deepened with people who truly respect me. Brenda's companionship on Wednesdays has become a highlight, filled with laughter, meaningful conversation, and shared reflections on life. Rhonda's visits every few months remind me of the joy of reconnecting with family members on healthy terms, without the strain of exploitation. Even simple pleasures like attending lectures at the library, exploring local museums, or reading mystery novels feel rich and fulfilling because they are chosen by me. For me, Ezra's visits bring genuine joy, a reminder that love can exist without sacrifice of self. I see the subtle changes in Terence, his attentiveness during visits, the effort to be punctual, and his new understanding of responsibility. Tiffany's polite demeanor, though still careful, signals that respect and boundaries have reshaped the family dynamic. These changes are not instantaneous miracles but the natural outcome of the consequences I allowed them to face. I understand now that setting boundaries is not cruelty. It is love, self-respect, and protection of my emotional space. Reflecting on the past 2 years, I realize how much courage it took to reclaim my life. Each step toward independence was met with resistance, guilt, and attempts at manipulation. Yet every challenge reinforced my resolve. I learned that the love I have for my family does not require surrendering my dignity or becoming a servant in my own home. The peace I feel now is hard-earned, a treasure I cherish more than any outward expression of familial duty. On Sunday afternoons when Ezra arrives, the joy is pure and untainted by obligation. We read stories, water the garden together, and share laughter that feels unhurried and sincere. The freedom to choose how I spend my time, what I eat, when I wake, how I move through my day, is a liberation I never thought possible at this age. Even Terence and Tiffany, in their attempts to build an independent life, have slowly begun to appreciate the value of self-reliance, responsibility, and respect. My role as a grandmother is now nurturing but limited, allowing love to flourish without exploitation. I cherish this balance deeply, understanding that healthy relationships thrive only when boundaries are respected. The emotional weight of the past, 6 months of servitude and endless compromise, has been lifted, leaving space for genuine joy, personal growth, and meaningful connections. I feel younger, more energetic, and profoundly alive. This reclamation of my life is a testament to the strength found in self-respect, a lesson I hope resonates with every woman who feels trapped by obligation and emotional manipulation. As I sit here today watching the sunlight pour through my kitchen window, I feel a quiet pride that hums through every corner of my being. I am no longer a prisoner in my own home, no longer a servant to entitlement or manipulation. Every decision I made, the eviction, the boundaries, the refusal to be exploited, was an act of courage, an affirmation that my life, even at 73, is mine to live fully. Ezra's laughter echoes through the house on Sundays, a reminder that love can exist without compromise, that joy can be found within the walls I fought to reclaim. Terence and Tiffany, in their struggles and eventual growth, are learning the hard lessons of responsibility and gratitude, lessons I was never meant to carry for them. And I, at last, am free to rediscover Estelle, the woman beyond mother, beyond caretaker, beyond the weight of others' expectations. To every woman listening to this story, know this: your age, your past sacrifices, or the expectations of others do not define your worth. You deserve respect, peace, and the right to choose your own happiness. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. It is self-love. Choosing solitude over toxic relationships is not loneliness. It is liberation. Stand tall, protect your dignity, and reclaim your life, no matter how late it seems. You are never too old to start anew, to live on your own terms, and to find joy that belongs solely to you. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect on your own life, share your thoughts in the comments, and pass this message to any woman who needs to hear that her voice matters. You have the power to reclaim your life, just as I did, and it is never too late to begin.